And for our last talk, we have Treat, Harvard homegrown professor, James Doyle, who is actually Joey and I's Alicia's teacher. We're taking his course right now on ancient ethics and modern morality. For some background, he went to Cambridge University, got his PhD at University of Virginia, and then spent some time lecturing at the University of Bristol before going to Princeton, where he was at the Institute for Advanced Study. He has a lot of academic interests, but primarily centered around Greek philosophy, Plato, certain issues in the philosophy of the action and mind, and he's currently working on books on the Gorgias and Elizabeth Anscombe. And I think he's assigned four chapters of his book in the reading packet. So, very delighted to have him.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. So this is all pretty extemporaneous, but I was going to say something about, it connects up with the Mr. Truman's Degree pamphlet, which has already been discussed a bit, but I wanted to talk about her 1958 paper, Modern Moral Philosophy, and her 1957 monograph, Intention, in connection with the opposition to Truman's Degree, because I think there are actually some quite important connections there that could go unnoticed. First I wanted to say something about modern moral philosophy in itself, and here I'm sort of repeating some of the main claims of the first half of my book, and sorry that there was so much. I would be sorry about it if I thought it were more likely that many people would have actually gone to the trouble of reading it all. But in the first half of the book, I argue that almost all interpreters of that 1958 paper have fundamentally misunderstood it. And I guess there's no way for that to be true without some of the blame attaching to Anscombe. She can't have been that good at making her meaning clear if nearly everyone misunderstood her. Nevertheless, I do also think that all it takes is like reading really carefully to see that this is undoubtedly what she really meant. But part of the received view of modern moral philosophy is that when she says that we should do away with talk of morality if it's psychologically possible, and she sort of diagnosed the problems with the moral vocabulary as having their origin in the abandonment, at least among intellectuals, of a divine command conception of ethics. A lot of, nearly everyone, it's pretty much everyone except Cora Diamond, just put it that way. Nearly everyone thought that what she meant was the vocabulary of morality was in perfectly good order prior to the demise of the divine command conception. And it was only with that demise that the vocabulary was no longer intelligible. They were right about that part. She does think that the vocabulary of morality is not intelligible independently of belief in a divine legislator. The part that they didn't get was that the Anscombe in modern moral philosophy claims that the vocabulary of morality is not intelligible even in conjunction with belief in a divine legislator. I think there can't really be any doubt that her real view is that the vocabulary of morality in any context is completely meaningless, which is to say, I argue in some detail for this in the book, it's in worse shape than a self-contradictory concept. Because self-contradictory concept is still a concept. Right? Frege uses the concept not identical with itself as part of his definition of the number 0. It's the number belonging to the concept not identical with itself in the Foundations of Arithmetic. And on Anscombe's assessment, the vocabulary of morality is worse off because, in the sense of being like, genuinely without even a self-contradictory meaning, for a actually strongly Wittgensteinian reason, and this actually goes back to a comment I made this morning. She thinks that the vocabulary of morality is an attempt to do ethics in terms of a form of practical modality that only makes sense in the context of divine command, right? That's where the misunderstanding comes in. It only makes sense in the context of divine command. So everyone thinks, oh, so morality was okay when there was divine command, but no. What only made sense was not the vocabulary of morality itself, but the form of practical necessity that it tries to give to ethics, right? Namely, a kind of the sort of obligation that arises when you're given an order by someone in authority, or you promise someone that you will do something, etc. That kind of obligation, which she subsequently in the 60s analysed in an extremely interesting way, Rules, Rights and Promises and other papers. So what was it that made sense then in the era when people believed in divine command was just that modality, but not as attaching to the vocabulary of morality, but as attaching to the vocabulary of divine command, right? So, for example, I was talking about this with someone at lunch, that according to the almost universal understanding of Anscombe's paper, she's claiming that someone like Aquinas, or pick any representative sort of authoritative Christian ethicist, would have thought that there were 3 completely independent reasons against, for example, murder. So one would be that it's contrary to the virtue of justice. The second would be that it's forbidden by God, and then the third would be it's also morally wrong. And it's really unclear what that, even if we can find a meaning for the vocabulary of morality, it's hard to see what that really adds to the picture. Certainly hard to see what it adds to one's incentives not to commit murder. So the vocabulary of morality then was never made sense. And the kind of incoherence, I mentioned that it was she deemed it incoherent for Wittgensteinian reasons, broadly speaking. That has to do with what I take to be fundamentally Wittgensteinian idea that a lot of ways of speaking, hesitate to use the expression language game, but a lot of ways of speaking do depend for their intelligibility on the existence of certain institutions and practices. And when those institutions and practices go missing, the result is not that the discourse becomes self-contradictory, but that it just becomes kind of meaningless babble. So one example she gives in Modern Moral Philosophy is if we imagine someone in a sort of newly reimposed state of nature, where all the institutions of civil society have kind of withered away, someone insisting on still talking in terms of the category criminal. And so Anscombe wants us to think about how little sense the vocabulary of criminality makes if there are no courts or and there's no judiciary and there's no judicial system, etc., etc. It sort of literally couldn't make less sense in her view, in her plausible view. So that's the kind of unintelligibility that she's arguing in Modern Moral Philosophy attaches to the vocabulary of morality. I should also mention, though, that by the vocabulary of morality here, we're talking about a particular use of it, but it still, I think, deserves to be thought of in our culture now as the central use, which is that it's a sort of sui generis, irreducible category of reason, character trait, consideration, policy, etc., etc. So it's the kind of it's the meaning that attaches to morality when, for example, you talk about someone, you're trying to describe someone, and you say, well, they're very witty and very athletic and so on, and some, yeah, but morally, what's he like? Or in other contexts, we might assign a very special status to the moral reasons or the moral considerations that face us in making a certain decision. And moral in that kind of context is understood as very much its own thing. It's not to be understood in terms of anything else. And Hobbes, for example, seems to have, at least if we retrospectively think about morality, even though it hadn't really, the relevant vocabulary hadn't yet really arisen, Hobbes is thought by many people to be giving the wrong kind of account of morality, again, pretending that he was doing that, because he gives an account of it in terms of individual self-interest. And the modern category of the moral, essentially, I think, that is by definition, stands opposed to the category of self-interest, and that's really the source of that huge divergence between the modern moral conception of virtue and the Greek conception that Anscombe is working with, because the Greek conception is conceptually tied to the happiness or flourishing eudaimonia of the agent, and so there's always, at least theoretically, there is always an intelligible reason for doing what virtue in the ancient sense requires you to do. That is an intelligible reason that hooks up one way or another with your own eudaimonia, and so in some sense can be you can think of yourself as getting something you want, right? So I think that's a principle that Anscombe holds to, that there's no such thing as an intelligible reason for action that doesn't involve the agent getting something that they want. That's probably too broad in various ways, but in the relevant set of contexts or dimension of assessment, I think that's something she also held, or at least she rejected the kind of denial of that principle that we find in, above all, Kantian ethics, where the authority of moral principles is supposed to, I mean, Kant's very overt about that, is supposed to be completely independent of any considerations having to do with the agent's interest. Okay, so what does this have to do with Truman? Basically, the idea is that alongside this kind of historical diagnosis according to which this vocabulary lacks any meaning at all, that's, I guess, reason enough to be opposed to it. But much worse than that, I think Anscombe thought that it basically made consequentialism possible. That is, without the vocabulary of morality, it wouldn't really be possible to frame consequentialism as a view in ethics, at least with any kind of plausibility, right? Because outside of the category of the moral, Anscombe, I think, rightly thinks that there's only two possible ways of thinking about ethics, philosophically speaking. One, and these aren't alternatives because one of them is necessary, and that's the virtue conception. I'm one of these people who's made uncomfortable by the expression virtue ethics, partly because it implies that there's there's another way of doing ethics. So that's, I mean, I prefer really to think of virtue ethics as just ethics. And the other is divine command, and divine command is that's the law conception of ethics, as she calls it, in modern moral philosophy. And again, this is something people haven't really picked up on. A lot of people have thought that Anscombe wants to contrast the law conception with the virtue conception, and the rise of virtue ethics has to do with hostility to a law conception, etc. But amazingly, she explicitly defines a law conception in terms of a virtue conception in modern moral philosophy. She says a law conception is one of ethics is one according to which, all the requirements on behavior, I'm paraphrasing very loosely, that are required for flourishing and being good qua human being, that is, all the requirements and norms that a virtue conception brings with it, are also commanded by God. Okay, so it's a sort of overdetermination story. And this is why the Christian and as it were, Hebrew Christian tradition of ethics is in a significant sense sort of secular, and Candace was talking about this earlier too, because of this overdetermination, because insofar as moral requirements, norms, ideals, etc., are underwritten by a virtue conception, in the relevant tradition, they're underwritten by appeal to practical reason, essentially. The idea is that these requirements, norms, and ideals can be thought of as requirements of practical reason, and an important component is just the cultivation of the right traits of character, and that's the only reason we think of this as virtue ethics. It's really a kind of rationalism. So Truman's rationale for dropping the bombs is like about as clear a case of consequentialism in action as you could get, and I think it sort of illustrates well what I mean when I say that Anscombe thinks that the vocabulary of morality makes consequentialism possible. So if Anscombe is right that the only intelligible ways of thinking about ethics are virtue and divine command, then dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is just a non-starter, because with respect to virtue, so-called virtue ethics, as she says elsewhere in the paper, better to, and this is like very important advice, better to stick to words like unjust, unchaste, etc., rather than morally wrong. And so, of course, the relevant question to ask about Truman's decision would be, was it just? And, the question answers itself. It's the kind of action that one might point to as a means of teaching someone the meaning of the word unjust. So that's not going to work. Divine command, similarly, it's all over the Hebrew Christian tradition that the taking of innocent life for any purpose is categorically forbidden. So what is it that we're talking about here, right? Enter the vocabulary of morality, right? And that enables people to say, and when I say here, I mean utter words rather than express propositions, that it enables people to, as it were, run away with the idea that there's actually something respectable to be said in favor of Truman's decision. That is that, of course, the people who are talking about this are people for whom the divine command conception is not really a live option anyway. That is, the people who would defend. Actually, that's not even true, as Anscombe herself pointed out. There were many self-professed Catholics who. Yeah. But so let's just draw a veil over that embarrassing fact. But in any case, people might say, okay, so it's obviously contrary to any traditional conception, recognizable conception of justice. Nevertheless, there's this other thing we can say about it, that it was morally justified, that it was morally okay, and sort of so much the worse for traditional categories of of justice or whatever, right? So absent the vocabulary of morality, as far as I can see, there simply wouldn't be anything that one could say to make the decision look, even at a distance and squinting, respectable. And so that was, I think, had a lot to do with Anscombe's hatred of consequentialism, because it makes possible things like that. So, absent the vocabulary, just summing that up, absent the vocabulary of morality, the only ways of justifying Truman, or the only way of justifying Truman in any sense whatever, given that justice and divine command are out of the picture, is just in terms of like murderous realpolitik, which among certain people is, we have to recognize, does count as a form of justification. If we look at modern moral philosophy, then the paper, in conjunction with the pamphlet, Mr. Truman's Degree, we can see that Anscombe thought that the vocabulary of morality is deeply pernicious and corrupting, because it makes it possible to act in accordance with murderous realpolitik and give one's actions a kind of ethical veneer or cachet that formally could only attach to actions that could plausibly be described as just. And it's another way of putting this, really, that the vocabulary of morality made consequentialism possible. The relevant quote from MMP here is from page 16, if I can find it. Is it where is? Oh, it's right at the front. Okay. Someone might have already mentioned this quote. Right, page 16. Here we see the superiority of the term unjust over the terms morally right and morally wrong. Here, she doesn't mean, in the case of Truman's dropping of the bomb, but she sort of might as well have done in terms of the relevance of this. For in the context of English moral philosophy since Sidgwick, it appears legitimate to discuss whether it might be morally right in some circumstances to adopt a procedure of judicial punishment of someone known to be innocent, but it cannot be argued that the procedure would in any circumstances be just. So I'm just really, my point really is just that the same goes for Truman's decision, as she says here, for judicial punishment of those known to be innocent. Okay. This also connects up with one of my. There are sort of three obiter dicta, would that be the expression? But there are three kind of throwaway remarks in modern moral philosophy, in which Anscombe, though she would probably be embarrassed to have it pointed out, but she's actually acting in the capacity of sage rather than philosopher. So I think Mary Geach said in the preface to one of the collections of papers that she distinguished between a sage and a philosopher, because sage is someone who just gives, sage advice about how to live and such like, whereas a philosopher is just someone like a contrary-minded person who likes to argue about stuff, really. But there are 3 points at modern moral philosophy where, possibly unconsciously, she's actually assuming the mantle of sage. And the saying that I have in mind here is, this is a quote from page 11, "I think it's quite characteristic of very bad degenerations of thought on moral psychological questions that they sound edifying." And of course, the vocabulary of morality is nothing if not edifying sounding. Okay, so that's modern moral philosophy. How many of time? Okay. That's modern moral philosophy. So the other thing I wanted to say, I don't want to take up too much more time, concerns intention. The connection here is somewhat looser, I think. I think with modern moral philosophy, it's quite a deep point. And, very, very good philosophers, if Anscombe is right, then very, very good philosophers have been bamboozled by the vocabulary of morality in this kind of way, into thinking that there's a content there and even that it might potentially justify actions that couldn't be justified under so-called virtue ethics. But with intention, it's more a matter of just clearing away confusion. I mean, I think that the relevant confusion is not one that would afflict anyone who has the discipline to try and think clearly about the relevant questions. But of course, such people are always few and far between anyway. And a lot of the purpose of intention is to clear away those kinds of confusions. And she's attacking the mindset, among other, I mean, looked at from the perspective of the pamphlet, she's attacking the mindset that would justify Truman from a different angle from the vocabulary of morality, although typically, of course, in conjunction with it. Some people would say that, Truman only really intended to end the war and save the lives of, like, any very, there's always a huge teeming multitude of U.S. Allied soldiers whose lives were saved in the official story here, but that it's only that was intended by Truman, and it was a regrettable necessity that but he couldn't be said to have intended the deaths of all those people. What he really intended was, etc. And the beginning of seeing what's wrong with that way of thinking is a point that Anscombe returns to again and again in Intention and any number of other writings, that actions are only intended under certain descriptions and not under others. And so to suggest that Truman intended this but not that, you're already misunderstanding what you're saying unless you take on board that particular point, because this and that might actually be the same action, just described differently. And of course, there are many cases any case of intentional action will be one on which it's intentional under some descriptions, but not others. And the basic principle here is that. I'm going to ignore Anscombe's arguments that even this is a fiction, that he intended to save all these lives and everything, right? Because the history there is very murky, and it is a bit suspicious that the Japanese got to keep their emperor, right? Because that was why they wouldn't agree to unconditional surrender, but they were allowed to keep him anyway. So, but leaving all that aside, Anscombe wants to really pin it on Truman. She doesn't just want to say that, in the language of the doctrine of the double effect, that he was culpable in the way that one's culpable for the foreseeably catastrophic consequences of one's actions. Anscombe wanted to make it stick, and quite rightly, that Truman has to be said to have intended it, not just foreseen it. And the important point here is that there's no intelligible account of what Truman was up to that doesn't make his murdering all those people a means to whatever purposes he had. And it seems that, shockingly, one can't even say that his purposes were merely to end the war and save Allied lives. But as I say, that's sort of another story. But she wants to say, because it was a means to an end that he had, even if he wouldn't acknowledge, and of course it was also a means to the end that he pretended to have. There's just no way out of conceding that he did intend it. And the relevant quote here is page 44 from Intention, in section 25. No, hang on, is that right? Where's my 40? Can't be page 40. Oh, yeah, it is. Sorry, okay. And there's a bit of context here. It's actually an example, a thought experiment Anscombe makes extended use of in Intention concerning someone who was hired to pump water to a house. There's a lot of other details surrounding it that I won't go into, but the water is poisoned, And then there's various variants on the case according as the guy who was hired to pump the water knows that it was poisoned, but doesn't care, knows that it was poisoned and is glad about it because he wants the people in the house to die, doesn't know that it was poisoned but didn't take enough care to find out whether it was, etc., etc. Okay. But the particular scenario that she's talking about here is if he knew that he was being hired to pump poisoned water, then he cannot disclaim the intention to poison the inhabitants of the house. Because if he was hired to pump poisoned water, then pumping poisoned water has to be a means to his end of earning his pay. And if it's a means to his end of earning his pay, then he's intending it. And the example in context makes this rather clearer than the relevant point is in the case of Truman and the bomb. So he cannot profess, she says, not to have had the intention of doing the thing that was a means to an end of his. Now, if he hadn't intended to, if he'd only been hired to pump water, and he'd known that the water was poisoned, the situation would be, in a certain sense, importantly different, because he could not then, or could not necessarily be said to intend to poison the inhabitants, because that would be instead the case where the consequence was merely foreseen and not intended. And as she says, it would be just as bad a case of murder as if it had been fully intentional. But still, in other contexts, it's important to keep track of which consequences are intended and which ones are foreseen and so on. Okay. So this looks, I conjecture, this looks pretty obvious, that you intend. You have to be said to intend actions you perform as a means to an end that you have. But at the time, 1957, there was essentially no systematic understanding of the ethical implications of the intentionality of human action. There was basically no philosophy of action since, I don't know, Aquinas.
Maybe since Aquinas. Yeah.
Maybe since Aquinas, yeah.
Davidson thought since Aristotle. But
right, yeah. That Geach was really annoyed about that, in fact.
Really
when Geach heard that Davidson had praised Anscombe's intention as the greatest contribution to the philosophy of action since Aristotle, Geach, her husband, said, outrageous, what about Aquinas? So by the intentionality of human action, I just mean that feature I mentioned earlier, whereby every action is intended under some descriptions and not others. This is actually quite a complicated fact. It's easy to describe, but very difficult to kind of accommodate within one's philosophical thinking about action. And a fortiori, it's very difficult to accommodate in one's thinking about ethics. But because there had been no systematic thinking about those questions, people, I think, easily became confused. And just to make it clear, I'm sure I would have been like among the most confused at the time if I had not read anything that Anscombe has written about the matter. And this confusion provides a kind of smokescreen or cover for all kinds of rationalizations of what Truman did, and facilitated all kinds of sophistical arguments about, Truman only, strictly speaking, intending to end the war or save the Allied lives or whatever. And it was that sort of cloud of sophistry that was among the aims of Anscombe's monograph to disperse. Okay, thanks. That's all I wanted to say. Oh, I didn't see, sorry. Yeah. Liam. Liam.
So the two, I suppose, overlapping categories of conceptions for understanding ethics are the most anciently necessary one, namely virtue, and it looks like the superadded one or the later integrated one with the divine command. Would you sort of explain how exactly we can, or what is the process by which you take something like Aristotle's original conception, which is notably sort of, needs a little doctrine to be baptized by Aquinas, because it's not obviously preoccupied with kinds of duties that sort of under the Christian dispensation we're worried about. So, I mean, that's the original criticism after all. It's sort of, you're importing paganism, and it's sort of not, isn't it? It's talking about, you know, you should be thinking so highly of yourself because of your work, because you're deserving of thinking highly of yourself, and therefore you have to say, well, that's not quite the way we have to do it in Christianity. But there's obviously enough of a foundation there to adapt the original concept of virtue ethics to include or combine it with the divine law understanding. So how do we merge those together in a consistent way without simply tacking on sort of a back formation?
Well, in a nutshell, more or less as Aquinas did it, and there's something to be said there about why that doesn't just count as tacking on, because in a certain sense, once you have like the Christian eschatology and so on, the structure of the ethic is to a certain extent transformed, because eudaimonia, happiness, flourishing, for Aristotle meant necessarily in this life. And in fact, pretty much for the Greeks, even the ones who did believe in an afterlife, it wasn't going to be probably much of an opportunity for flourishing. Whereas, of course, for Aquinas, eudaimonia is the beatific vision. And in fact, it's in one of the first 5, I can't remember which one, questions of Prima Secundae, that beatitudo, as he calls it, is not attainable in this life, right? And then the other aspect in which it's not just tacked on is that Aquinas also expands the conception of what a virtue might be to include characteristics whose necessity or the advisability of the acquisition of which is revealed. And that's faith, hope, and love. I mean, they function fully as virtues in the ethic in just the same way as the others, but it's still a kind of radical departure, because for Aristotle, a virtue is essentially a kind of rational structure or a rationally structured habit, a habit that involves not necessarily on every occasion of its exercise, but it involves in a very intimate way the operation of practical reason, as it were ex nihilo, that is, not in a way that, of course, doesn't depend upon anything that's revealed. Whereas with the theological virtues, that's no longer the case.
So is the reason that the theological virtues are not, or can be sort of pursued to an infinite degree, rather than in the way the natural virtues or the attainable virtues are, or sort of rational means? Does that arise specifically from the fact that they're revealed, or is that part of the...
No, I mean, it doesn't seem to me to be conceptually required. I mean, it's not ruled out by the Aristotelian conception of virtue that there might be virtues which work in the way that Shelley Kagan thinks morality works, which is essentially insatiably demanding. It's rather the basis of the virtue as being in revealed truth as opposed to practical thinking. That's the big difference. And I suspect that Candace will know this better than I do, but I think I have the sense from the Aquinas I have read that he doesn't think that Aristotle is really anywhere that far wrong with respect to the secular part of ethics. I mean, the most dramatic divergences from Christian ethics have to do with the theological virtues. I don't think that it doesn't seem to me very likely anyway that we ever would have come to think that there was anything much wrong with the kind of thing that Aristotle calls megalopsychia, greatness of soul. I don't think that anyone would have sort of thought to question the status of these highly self-assertive, sort of slight echoes of Homer type Greek virtues, unless Christianity had come along with its purported revealed truth and its associated idea that humility is a virtue. It's very hard to imagine natural circumstances in which humility would come to be seen as a virtue independently of revelation.
It's also the case that the theological virtues are infused, so they're sources from God. You can't get them under your own steam, and that matters a lot. So they can't be, in that sense, acquired. I mean, you can engage in various practices to try to get yourself far enough out of the way that God can work through you after these fashions, and all of the acquired virtues that he takes up from Aristotle and from Ambrose and from, that they have infused counterparts. The difference is at least this: the source of the infused ones is God, and they're directed to beatitude. Whereas the acquired ones are pretty much directed to having things go all right in temporal affairs. So there are various big distinctions that operate with these, and so powerfully that the ordering of things shifts when you start talking about the theological virtues, even the theological counterparts of acquired virtues.
Right, I was totally forgetting that aspect of things. But although also this is not, in the first instance, a way in which as Candace says, it's not actually a way in which the theological virtues are contrasted with the acquired ones, because the acquired ones are supposed to be thought of in this new way too. I think it's especially clear in Augustine, because it's a constant refrain really in Augustine that, first step, before anything else, right, nothing else makes sense without this, total submission to God.
Yeah.
Right.
Step two.
Right. Yeah. But I think but when he says, without this you can't have anything else, I think he also includes the kinds of virtues that we read about in Aristotle, because original sin means that we can no longer be sanguine in the way that Aristotle was, that we can, by our own resources, even do enough to get along with each other here, right? So grace is required there too. And then a fortiori with faith, hope, and love. I mean, they are forms of grace, essentially, I take it. Does that?
Yes, thank you.
Will.
So I have a question about back to the definition of morality. So I think if I went off and asked any college student what their sense of morality was, I think you'd probably get 95% of cases some sort of variant on Rawlsian self-harm, harm principle. You can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't affect someone else. What do you think Anscombe would think of that?
There, I think Anscombe would say, I'm quite confident about this because it's something she does say, that the virtue of justice actually is in some respects quite close, as it were, extensionally to our pseudo concept of morality. That, in other words, a lot of the kinds of action that are required by justice are also falsely believed to be required by morality. I say falsely believed because morality can't require anything because it doesn't mean anything. But a great deal, I suspect, of what the 95% would say with respect to reciprocity-based conceptions of ethics she would say, yes, that just belongs to the relatively uncontroversial part of justice. So she can really make sense of a lot of that in that way, I think. And that's a virtue. So that's all within that's all under the auspices of what I think she takes to be sort of the only intelligible secular basis for thinking about ethics.
Right. What do you think she would say about to show that it's not enough?
I think the main way in which it's not enough is not quite the right expression here. It's more kind of leading you in the wrong direction. So here I would just revert to what I was saying about the paper Modern Moral Philosophy in the first part of what I said, whereby the difference that the difference between the vocabulary of morality and the vocabulary of justice is that the vocabulary of morality holds out the prospect, the totally chimerical prospect of justifying actions like Truman's. Whereas if you stick to the vocabulary of justice, it's at least a lot more difficult to justify that kind of action. Yeah. Unless you didn't, when you said why isn't it enough, you didn't mean with respect to theological virtue, by comparison with theological virtue or anything like that. You just meant with respect to a secular conception of justice.
I meant the idea that you can construct morality out of just the idea of I'm going to do whatever I want.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't touch you.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it's enough.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, good, right. Sorry, I didn't really get that bit. Yeah, right. She talks about that in Modern Moral Philosophy too. And this is an especially confusing part of the paper where she contradicts her definition of a law conception of ethics. Because, as I said, the law conception of ethics is essentially, the way she defines it, it's about divine command. And then later in the paper she says, some people who don't believe in God cast about for an alternative source of, law, a moral, ethical law. And she says this search has some interest in it. And that seems to me just contradicts her definition. And what she has to say about it is, if someone were to make such a claim, then I would want to see the system worked out. And she says that principles like what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, might get you some distance in it. Well, they obviously do get you some distance, quite a distance in ethics, but they're unlikely to undergird prohibition on sodomy, for example. So she thinks, so relative to the traditional, i.e. Hebrew Christian conception of justice, a kind of reciprocity-based or broadly contractual approach is not going to get you that kind of thing.
Can I say something quick on that and then suggest a return to Catherine's question from the last session, which I thought might be... Just very briefly, if 95% of students say that you get to do what you want except harming people, that doesn't mean that 95% of people agree. It just means they sort of utter the same sentence when asked the question. And one feature of the sentence is there's a sort of deep vagueness built into it. Like the notion of harm is very nebulous, and what that allows you to do is reverse engineer accounts of why you shouldn't, or it's okay to do things you think you shouldn't, or it's okay to do. And we're notorious for sort of just coming up after the fact with accounts of harm designed to justify intuitions which are being generated from other sources. But I thought it might be useful to go back to Catherine's question about sort of how Anscombe might have dealt with rather different cases, just because I think with sort of double effect, sometimes kind of playing with the variables can help to sort of lock in the role things are playing. So I take it there were two parts of the question, right? There was what happens if it was 5 rather than 200,000 killed by direct attack, and then what to do about famine that arises as a consequence. And I thought the first half is the easier half, that just whatever the number is, if it's more than 0, you don't get to kill them intentionally as a tactic of war.
Right, so even if Truman had merely walked up to someone on Fifth Avenue and shot them.
Yes.
In the head,
Yes.
that would be enough to not give him a degree. But, sorry, go on.
I no idea where that example came from. But the second half would allow us to sort of dig into an area which I think we've alluded to, but not really dug into, about how foreseen but unintended consequences work in this system. Because surely it can't be Anscombe's view that you could never do something that you would predict would result in famine. For the same reason, her view can't be you could never do something which you predict will result in the death of an innocent person. So could you say a little bit more about how she thinks about foreseen but unintended consequences?
Yeah, she has a very interesting paper on the doctrine of double effect. But yeah, I mean, when my thought about that question was simply that for Anscombe, as for probably very many ethicists, everything's going to depend upon the degree to which the famine's predictable. And if it's fully predictable, then the case isn't really changed from the dropping of the bombs. That is the ethical facts with respect to culpability and blame and evil and all the rest of it. But sorry, go on.
But surely there's a kind of case where it's predictable, but it's not a means to your end.
Right.
It's consequent.
Right.
And it seems that is at least potentially justifiable.
Right. Yes. No. Sorry. Yeah. So, if the famine were entirely predictable, it would be like the guy pumping the poisoned water, knowing it was poisoned, but he'd only been hired to pump water and not to pump poisoned water. That is, it would be a foreseen but not intended effect. But then further, that fact is essentially ethically inert, because the consequence is so bad that it kind of doesn't matter whether it was intended or foreseen anyway. So the foreseen versus intended distinction only really comes into play when you've got kind of marginal cases where you have consequences that it's plausible to suppose might be justified by some overall bad consequences that might be justified by some other aim. Right, as a certain degree of civilian casualty might be an inevitable side effect of permissible military action without making that military action impermissible. It's only in the cases where the foreseen harm is not like radically catastrophic. The question even arises whether the doctrine of the double effect might be used to defend it. Yeah. Sorry, Candice, you were going to...
Yeah, I was just going to... If your thought is that what I have to do is spread terror in the population in order to end the war, and the way, my means of spreading terror, instead of carpet bombing or dropping nuclear, right, is taking out the rice paddies or something, or taking out the entire fishing industry or something like that, then I'm culpable for then I'm using mass murder as the mass death and suffering of a lot of people as a means to my end. And so that's different, I expect, from a situation where I don't know. It's hard to think of one where it's really innocent, but okay, here's one. It is if we try to do a huge infrastructure that connects many tiny isolated villages in northern India, an infrastructure project that involves building highways, it is an absolutely foreseeable consequence of that there will be traffic fatalities in that part of India that were not there before. But you would be nuts on Anscombe's view if you took it that building, provided that the construction is sound, provided, that things are all right, given the increasing possibilities of commerce, education, getting medical supplies from one place to another, all of that, and that's the reason for the fact that there will be traffic fatalities at a level that had not been seen in that part of the world before cannot be viewed as an intended consequence of the infrastructure improvement, even though it's completely foreseeable. And any actuary can tell you, well, here's a thing that will happen.
Yeah. That seems right to me. And one thing maybe to underline here is that there are some things which are just always ruled out as intentional actions, where if they're consequences which are foreseeable side effects, it's not that that means therefore they're okay, it's just the way they're taken into account works quite differently. So if the number of predictable deaths on the road were to be high enough, it would be a reason not to do it. But
I don't know if she would think that, actually.
oh,
Well, I mean, if it would be a lot higher than any of the lives that might be saved by the better availability of medicine, etc.
She doesn't. She's pretty hostile to body count reasoning. In some respects, for the reason that Hegel was pretty hostile to body count reasoning. Like, you're not.
Human beings aren't fungible.
Right. Human beings aren't fungible. You don't. Obviously, look, I ride around in cars, right? I'm getting a lift to the airport places my life in more danger than climbing on a plane and heading to my destination, right? But everybody would take it that if I die heading to the airport at an insanely early hour of the morning tomorrow, my flight leaves at 5:30, so then that's an accident. And similarly, the traffic fatalities, unless we're hiring a group of mad drivers or something, as part of this, like we're also gonna run a racetrack along one lane of the highway. That I take it that those are going to be many accidental deaths. Just like if I don't make it to Logan, that's going to be an accidental death. Even though I know the stats on car trouble versus, whatever else. I mean, walking across the street in Boston is perilous, right? It's like...
So, I take the point about not wanting to sort of count bodies, but there has to be some way of doing proportionality, right, for traditional just war criteria to apply. So if likelihood of success is sort of necessary to justify the war, then she has to have some kind of way of factoring in predictable but accidental deaths, even if it's not straightforwardly numerical.
Right. I mean, look, one of the things she wanted to rule out with the poisoned water example, I take it, is a situation where I say it's got to be okay to bomb the enemy's field hospital, because all that's happening there, although all of the medical personnel are going to die, in addition to all the people we tried to kill and failed to kill in combat, those people are just patching these folks up. And the natural result of that is going to be to send them back into combat, where they're going to, attack us. And I can tell you, that if this batch gets patched up and sent back into combat, their fury over having been stuck in a field hospital is going to be such that they're going to be mad dogs once they get back in the battlefield again. And we will be lucky if they don't massacre our guys in their sleep or something during a declared ceasefire, whatever. I mean, make it as bad as you like. It's still not going to be okay to bomb the field hospital on this view. That is, even if it is somehow weirdly predictable.
But that's a case which is going through the intentional killing of non-combatants.
Right.
So my claim is it's only when you have deaths which are in the side effect category the questions of balancing or proportionality would apply.
Right. I mean, that's probably right. But it's sort of, but it's the two really expert casuists I know, both of whom live in Rome. It's very tricky business to do serious casuistry well.
Yeah.
And it's the sort of thing that, you know, you spend a few hours with the manualist tradition and you think, this is really very hard. And I think she's allowing that it's really very hard.
If I could just briefly add something I forgot to say, and a slight qualification actually, because I said with respect to the point she makes in Intention about that's relevant to Truman, by contrast with the point she makes in Modern Moral Philosophy, that it's sort of obvious and it's a matter of just clearing up the kind of confusion that can be seen to be obvious in retrospect and so on. That's not quite right, I think, because, and I'm thinking now about the paper about Doctrine of Double Effect, because I mean, the key to Intention, the book, and the key to like everything that Anscombe wrote about mind, is that she wants to overturn Cartesian conceptions. That's like the dominant theme, like everywhere. And this is a good example of that because it's an example. If I say this at the very end of the book, actually, now I remember that this is actually a point of contact between Cartesianism and like moral degradation, because the Cartesian conception of intention is essentially, I mean, what determines what your intention is on an influential Cartesian conception is, as Anscombe uncharitably describes it in that paper, giving a little speech to yourself, right? So on that conception, it would actually be legitimate, and probably, before, for people for whom the Cartesian conception was deeply embedded and they never thought about the logic of intentional action and so on, it probably might well have sounded quite plausible to a lot of people to say that Truman didn't intend the deaths, because as he was ordering the bombs to be dropped, he just gave a little speech to himself saying, I don't intend the deaths, I just intend to save the Allied lives and the end of the war and all the rest of it. Sorry?
It was a gentleman with a blue shirt kind of passed me.
Okay. Yeah. In the corner, yeah.
First, I just wanted to sort of put out there as a matter of historical fact, when Truman did it, so he became president right after FDR, and there's a quote from Groves, who was the sort of general in the army ahead of the Manhattan Project. He said Truman was like a little boy on a toboggan going down a hill. So his actual ascent to his point would be that the Manhattan Project was already so far along that, as a matter of historical fact, it may not be that Truman is like shorthand for certain personnel who made this decision, but it may not be fully that individual's fault. That's one just sort of historical thought.
Can I address that before you go on, though? Because, I mean, is the problem that it took Eisenhower to formulate the buck? Was it Eisenhower? No, it was Truman himself. The buck stops here. I mean, the point of the office of the presidency is that, with respect to decisions like that, you bear the responsibility. And it's not as though Truman. It's not as though there's really evidence that. I mean, it's not as though Truman didn't know about it, and it's not as though. I mean, it's not as though in any sense Truman didn't okay it. So it's very unclear to me how this is supposed to mitigate anything.
I suppose it's just the military sort of interests were not coming at him in a neutral manner. But yeah, then he would have had to sign off on all of it.
Right,
And
right.
One of the
my question is more about the first, when you were talking about the relation between MMP and the bombing. You said that the use of moral language as opposed to language of justice helped justify this thing that otherwise would have been unjustifiable. What exactly about the language of justice would have mitigated the justifiability of the action?
Right. good question. I mean, I think. Sorry, I know, Candice, you want to
No,
say
go ahead.
something
No,
earlier,
no,
but you
that's
after
all right.
we'll get back to it. I think one of the main points there would be that like justice is a concept with a history, like all ethical concepts, and so there's a lot less about what you can, the kinds of propositions you can express using sentences with the word justice in it or just. There's a lot less about that that's up to us than there is with respect to the vocabulary of morality. The vocabulary of morality is like extraordinarily versatile and multiform, and you know there are very few actions that it's like obviously self. I mean, this is kind of the point, really. This really shows the very close connection with consequentialism. There are very few, the concept of morality, the pseudo concept of morality, is such that, or rather, you know, the rules by which we use the word are such that, you know, there are very few, if any, actions which it would just be self-evidently absurd to say are immoral. By that I mean that there's the casuists could, or people who've practiced on casuistry can often construct elaborate counterfactual scenarios on which, no, actually the torturing of the child was the only moral option, really, you know. But you can't do that with justice, just because, you know, justice is a virtue term with a history that's as old as the history of ethics, and so there's much more by way of constraint about what can intelligibly said, what can intelligibly be said with respect to classifying things as just, by comparison with what can be apparently intelligibly said when it comes to classifying things as moral. Does that help? Candice, what do you want to say?
Oh, no, I was just gonna, I mean, I thought one of the complaints that was made against Anscombe when she was protesting Truman was that Truman didn't kill anybody, he just signed a piece of paper with
Right.
his name. And one of the things that she told Mary Geach, who's not, I don't think yet Mary Geach,
Can you speak up, Candice?
one of the things that she told Mary was that it was important to write intention so that you had an account of how it was that a certain person in certain circumstances just signing his name to a piece of paper constituted, you know, made him responsible for mass murder.
Well, was the action of mass murder?
Exactly.
In fact, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, yeah, this is another way in which I understated things when I suggested that the stuff that's cleared away by intention is more or less obvious confusions, even in retrospect. Because even now, to most people who haven't read intention, the idea that the act of signing a piece of paper could be literally the same action as mass murder is on at first sight odd looking. But it doesn't take that much. I still want to say it doesn't take that much reflection on the nature of action to see that can be the case. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about justice and its relationship to blame. I'm mostly thinking about like the kind of the example of the punishment of the innocent, you know, to prevent, you know, the mob from burning down the town. If the person is to, and let me know if there's a problem in the way I'm framing this, but if it is obvious that if the, you know, the magistrate who decided, oh well, we will punish this one person to stop the mob, it is obvious that you know, justice was not rendered unto that innocent person, and the magistrate is the one who intended it, but then who is to blame? Is it the mob who is to blame, or is it the magistrate, or is it both?
It's the mob.
It's the mob.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And convicting the innocent person, even if it does prevent all those deaths, it again cannot intelligibly be called an act of justice. Right. I also wanted to add to that, actually, because I think my reply to the earlier question about this was kind of weak, because it's not just a matter of, this is a word with a long history. Well, then we just get rid of it, The real point is that the vocabulary of virtue is eudaemonist. That is to say, there's always going to be an intelligible reason for doing what's just that has to do with the agent getting something they want. Because according to the official story, if you act unjustly, you're kind of, as Anscombe puts it, ruining your life in essentials in some way, in some admittedly obscure way, but still, that is the official story, if we're going to call justice a virtue at all in the relevant Greek sense. So in those terms, the problem with consequentialism, the problem with convicting the innocent person in order to placate the mob, is that there's actually not an intelligible motivation for it, because it can't contribute to the well-being, or you can't be said to be avoiding ruining your life in the way that you can with respect to acting in accordance with a virtue. And I mean, I think there's a symptom of this where, and Anscombe is particularly savage about this aspect of things, I think, in the Truman case and in others, that this kind of comes out in the idea that there's actually something especially heroic about Truman, because he was prepared to, go against every fiber of his upbringing and defy conventional standards of ethics, etc. And this is obviously absurd. But one reason it's absurd is that no ground of motivation can be found in the vocabulary of morality in this kind of case that will provide us with an intelligible motivation in terms of the agent getting what they want.
If I follow, so in this case, does the magistrate share any blame in the outcome?
Well, it depends how you tell the story, but as told so far, none at all. No.
So what was, the right choice in terms of whatever, like virtue ethics, divine command, justice? What was? Is there a right choice in that scenario, or is there not?
Yeah. Are you asking what Anscombe would say?
Yeah, sure.
Or what I would say? It doesn't matter because it's the same. That's not always the case, but in this case, the idea would just be that, the right answer is don't convict an innocent person. And that's why the vocabulary of justice is preferable to that of morality, because it enables us to see in a totally perspicuous way what the right thing to do is and why the other things are wrong.
You know how Bernard of Clairvaux solved this problem? When the angry mob was ready to kill people, he would come out and he would say, if anyone touches this person, I'm going to chop your hands off. And the mob dispersed.
You can't do that today.
Not in the West.
Political correctness gone mad.
Did you get the window out of Edinburgh?
So that's the, and it's partly a point about agency too. Yeah, the way the case is described, it is the mob who kill these other people. So, what exactly is the obstacle to ascribing the responsibility to the mob? It's being foreseen is neither here nor there. If you start to think in terms of what's foreseeable, then you're very quickly on the road to consequentialism. Yeah, sorry, Matt.
Thanks, Alan. So I had a question, I guess, between two of you. It seemed I was working out, trying to see if there's a difference between the two views that you had presented. The potential difference might be on, like, the overdetermination type view between a divine command ethic and a virtue ethic. But it seemed like Professor Vogler, on your account, at least in the case of your stopping modals, you seem to think that the virtue ethic was insufficient and you needed kind of a spiritual understanding of a human person. I'm wondering, Professor Doyle, if you think that the virtue ethic, natural virtue ethic approach can provide for like what Professor Vogler was talking about in terms of stopping modals, or if that's another case where there's just like an overdetermination between a divine command and the virtue ethic.
Right. Shall I say? Do you mind if I go first?
No, not at all.
Yeah, we have to distinguish here between figuring out what the right thing is to do and being able to do it. And what's overdetermined when you add in divine command is simply what the requirements are, the norms, the ideals, right? That is more or less fully accessible to unaided human reason. But one way in which Christianity changes the story, even with respect to acquired virtue and the Aristotelian virtues, is that it rejects what seems to be Aristotle's assumption that it's within our power to live up to these requirements and ideals and norms, and for a Christian to deny that is essentially Pelagianism. So I think that that's where in the case of someone like Aquinas, the Christianity makes a huge difference, even with respect to the portion of ethics which, even on his account, is in a certain sense secular. It has to do with, as I say, we see even more vividly in Augustine, that you just don't have any hope of doing anything the way you really should unless you just totally submit yourself to God, because he resists the proud. Anything to add, Candace?
Just that I think she, like Geach, saw that there was a distinction between internalizing the kinds of things that are matters of prohibition, which are act types that are never okay to do, which, I mean, Aristotle and Aquinas are aligned here, right? They don't recognize positive requirements geared to act types, right? So there's almost never, only one thing to do, right? At least in Anscombe's sense, there's really clearly not, almost never, just one thing to do. I'm to pay my bills. Am I to instruct my bank to make a transfer electronically? Am I to walk into an office and hand somebody cash? Am I to write a check? I mean, there's more than one way to discharge the obligation, right? And the talk about stopping modals is talk about how we can ever be equipped to work with, deploy, use, abide by these things. So it's about the way in which these become part of how we are with one another and how they're in our repertoire. For Geach and Anscombe, Anscombe even says, look, God can't give us any commands except in a natural language, right? Even God is constrained by the fact that we're discursively reasoning beings, right? The question about how to justify these is a different kind of question. How to justify the thought that there's kinds of things it's in our power to do. We've even got names for these act types, right? And we can pick them out if we see them, or are contemplating them, if we're not deceiving ourselves about what we're intending or aiming at. But why there should be any kinds of action that are never good to do and always bad. I mean, basically Aristotle says the name implies badness, right? That's what he says. So it sounds like it's a conceptual problem of some sort. But presumably, that's not going to look like a full-scale justification about why it's never okay to do these things. There are people who act like God is the great cost-benefit guy in the sky, and he will just arrange it so that given the endlessness of a human life, it'll all iron itself out over eternity or something. That's not the view. The way that these are supposed to be rooted in something on the order of eternal law, divine law, is supposed to go right to the heart of the kind of thing a human being is, understood in relation to the divine, not just in relation to our fellow human beings. And that's a different sort of a ground for things. So Geach makes fun of Foote on this score and says, well, yes, of course, if I deliberately act ill, I'm going to wreck my hard-won integrity. I'm going to go against the things I regard as most important and most basic, at which point the proper response, he thinks, is to say, aren't you, but I mean, look at the catastrophic thing that will result if you refuse to act ill, if you refuse to do the disgraceful thing. Don't you have a hand to burn for your colleagues, your friends, whatever. And I mean, the structure of philosophy examples about this are sort of like, I'm put in a position where I'm told to do something horrible, vivisect all the children in the local daycare by a credible band of thieves of murderers and awful men who, it's usually men, who are, but you could have sinister women claiming my sisterhood in all of this, who say either you hit the local daycare center and vivisect all the children, or will vivisect all the children nationwide. I mean, just make it as big as you like. Some arbitrarily large group of children are going to be vivisected.
We'll nuke LA or something. Yeah.
Yes, something like that. Right. And it's got to be the case that I can still refuse. Right. And what are the grounds for my refusal? It can't be I need to minimize the number of vivisections of children or dead bodies or something like that. It's got to be something else. And that something else is, as near as I can tell, Anscombe and Geach both thought, what's required in order to really ground prohibition. And that something else is, I think, what she's pointing to when she talks about the spiritual nature of the human being. I mean, she sometimes will just fall into the dignity talk for it, but I think it's really sanctity talk. It's like, I'm violating one of the most basic things I need to understand about my fellow human beings if I, as an end or a means or anything, decide to perform such an action.
Question. So insofar as it depends upon considerations arising from the spiritual nature of human beings, we're still not in the realm of revelation, though, is that right?
Well, I think it's through revelation that we get an accurate understanding of the spiritual nature of human beings. But I suppose you could be some kind of pragmatic spiritual nature of human beings guy, like Haldane tries to be sometimes.
Well, what I'm getting at here is just that it seems like it's supposed to be just a sort of straightforward ethical precept or matter of acquired virtue, that one refused to do outrageous things merely because a bad person threatens to do even worse things if you don't. Right. And so it would fall into the whole overdetermination category of required by virtue, but also required by divine law. So I'm just wondering where you think, like, Anscombe's conception of the spiritual nature of human beings informing that kind of understanding of why you mustn't do this, even if it will prevent that. to what extent, well, whether she too does see it as belonging to something accessible. I mean, put it this way, is the spirituality of human beings, the essential spirituality of human beings itself something that's, never mind the details, but just the fact of it, is something available to natural human reason?
I think that's why she talks about connatural knowledge in this regard.
In other words, yes, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
It's like, if I have the capacity to recognize a fellow human being as such,
Right.
if I'm not so corrupted that I've lost the ability to actually understand my fellow human beings as fellow human beings, then I understand that there's certain I will automatically understand there's certain kinds of things I can't do to them.
But insofar as it's a matter of something accessible to natural reason, it's still something which is kind of in principle available to Aristotle. And we do get a weird kind of pre-echo of it in Aristotle, I think, because a lot of the kinds of action that, according to Aristotle, as I understand it, are not to be done under any circumstances, are not to be done under any circumstances because they're bestial. Right, and that's a point about the status of human beings, I take it.
I mean, what does he recognize? He recognizes an absolute prohibition on adultery. You wouldn't think that every single instance of adultery looked like bestiality.
No, I meant, first of all, I wasn't talking about bestiality in that sense, but no, I just meant a class of actions that he thinks must never be performed under any circumstances. The rationale is because they're bestial, that's all.
Right. But
Not all of them by any means.
But I think it's a really weird argument to make about even the ones that he recognizes as such. So absolute prohibition on murder and adultery, where you think adultery isn't even conceivable apart from human institutions and our participation in them.
Right.
Right. So it's really weird to say that the problem there is it's like an animal, because an animal couldn't even.
Yeah, no, certainly he's not. He doesn't. That's not going to be his rationale for the prohibition on adultery at all. It's going to be a rationale for a prohibition on. Bestiality.
Yes.
In the sense of zoophilia. That's also bestial in the broader sense, and so that would be the rationale in that case for never engaging. Sorry, right. So on that note, on that. Thanks.
Maybe one last question just to wrap things up. One for each of you, maybe to address. Why is Anscombe valuable for undergrads? How is it applicable to our lives?
This is a wrap-up question?
Yeah. We each get 30 seconds.
You can go first this time.
Okay, thanks.
There's one more thing that when we go across campuses, kind of selling Anscombe or the name Anscombe to students who could care less, what should we say?
She's undoubtedly one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's the thing to say. In terms of why we should care, I think it's because she's genuinely devoted to trying to figure out the truth about central aspects of what it is to be a human being and live a human life, a properly human life. And that's a huge thrust of her work, and you cannot say that about other 20th and most 21st century moral philosophers at all.
Right.
I think what I said earlier, she's a great example of intellectual fortitude, especially for a young, aspiring intellectual or even an activist of some sort. She's a great example of intellectual fortitude, which is commitment to discover the truth, even at the cost of the skin of your teeth.
There are many reasons, but one would be that she, of all 20th century philosophers, is most alive to the fact that we don't understand what we ourselves are saying unless we have a certain amount of knowledge about the logical profile and the history of our concepts.
I was going to say something very similar to Jeff, that I think there's much of what she says which is true and interesting on philosophical grounds, but the really short answer is she's an exemplar from a discipline that doesn't produce many of those. And I do think, I mean, philosophers aren't especially bad, but we're not, especially bad. But I do, so pertinent to some of the interests of people around the table, the Love and Fidelity Network and so on, I think it's important to recognize that there are certain debates where you may hold opinions which are unfashionable, and many of the people who are on the other side of the debate aren't there because they hold equal and opposite convictions, but because they go where most people go. And I think there's a commitment to her to really thinking things through. I hadn't heard, but I was very impressed by the story Candace told this morning about how seriously she took people who came to her with genuine questions. Like people who sort of respect the task before them as something worth the serious struggle of getting your thinking clear. And I think that's exemplary. And I think being willing to do that even in situations where you're discouraged from doing it, but also being willing to recognize that in others. And one way in which I think she's an exemplar to be followed is not just for you to struggle through the questions, but for you to take seriously other people who are part of the same struggle, whether or not they're coming from the same place.
Perfect. On that note, let's thank. Also, one more for all 4 professors. Okay, so now we have 2 hours for dinner, 1 hour to eat, and then 1 hour to freshen up or talk or whatever you want. And then Danilo and James at AEI have kindly set up a whole beautiful reception for us. It'll be at their office, which is across the street. And we'll head over there together at 8 o'clock. Okay.
So tomorrow we begin again here at 9 a.m. I know some people are traveling back today, I understand. For those who are not, we're all invited to breakfast tomorrow. We'll have it here again, and we'll pretty much go up to, this is not exclusively a Catholic group, but it's 11 a.m. when everyone then goes to Mass, and then everyone will be departing after that. So that's kind of the schedule for the night. The meal is here, and then reception, then tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. here, and then we're in essence done at 11. So thanks again to Will and Joey for coordinating all this, and
Yeah.
for a wonderful
Yes.
conversation.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.